I don't know if I've commented on this exchange before, but this is okay. This is a commentary on Bret Weinstein's Dark Horse podcast, where he is having a discussion with Sam Harris on free will. And I haven't finished watching the whole thing. I've only watched two-thirds of it, just over two-thirds of it. And I mean, I was kind of anticipating something bad, and this is kind of, I mean, it's not exactly what I had anticipated, but I knew that there would be something on this level of bullshit, essentially. And it's interesting because I've listened to Bret Weinstein have an interview on Rebel Wisdom about bad faith, and I think that these two things are, and I left a comment on that video as well, but anyway, those two, these topics I think are worth pooling together. And I will actually have to, I guess, finish watching this podcast to see sort of where it goes. But I mean, I can tell in Bret Weinstein's exasperated sort of handling, or obviously not overt exasperation, but at least subtextually, there's exasperation with Sam Harris's. I mean, it's you can't really call it bad faith, but it's a sort of, I don't know. I think it's a kind of nescient projective sort of issue, which is thematically very similar to bad faith. This actually, I guess, ties in more with the comment that I made. Um, that there's a kind of psychological bad faith, which I think is at play here with Sam Harris. Um, So let me just say what I've seen in these 2 hours out of the 3 hour podcast. I've seen Bret trying to get to what he thinks is the fertile part of an aspect of a discussion which he wants to have with Sam Harris. And so he has to carefully make his way to that fertile field of exploration. And Sam Harris is sort of just repetitively re-engaging his hobby horse argument against which Bret almost, I think, masterfully almost tried to say, let's not rehash the straw man, which is not relevant to this discussion because I'm on the same page on that issue. And Sam Harris can't help but reincarnate that scripted argument that he's used to having because he doesn't want to go anywhere new. And so you see Sam Harris for 2 hours preemptively constructing a counter argument so as to divert from actually reaching an actual argument, to divert from hearing the actual fucking argument. You know, it's intolerable. It's absolute, because you're not hung up on this issue. You're hung up on the fact that Sam Harris can't outlay a, an iota of intellectual charity to say, well, I'm not even making a distinct point of argument here. I just want to explore this issue because I think that it should be canonical. And essentially he just keeps on reinvigorating this psychological sense of freedom because I guess his whole mythos or metaphysical pantheon is so centered around that hobby horse, is so centered around that making that particular polemic, that particular style of argument, and he is so afraid of going into anything that doesn't resemble that dilemma, you know. And so I mean, what do we get here? We get someone again who is effectively preemptively making a counter argument inanely in order to pontificate over descriptions that have already been assented to by both sides. I mean, I guess you could say that there's a bit of a technical description in some sense because essentially Sam Harris doesn't believe that there's any other interpretation that can be had, and so this is the field that has to be worked with, and so he's he's outlaying this intellectual sympathy that he has with this illusion of free will, and he wants to make that the canonical centerpiece of what is being discussed, because he's got a masterful treatment of that issue, and he doesn't want to venture into having treatments of any other issue. And then he actually says around the 2 hour 10 minute mark, 2 hour 15 minute mark, 2 hour 20 minute mark, somewhere around there, he says to Bret, well, why do you even have when it's around when they're talking about the movie experience, and he's like, why do you think that chance changes things? Well, let him fucking get to it. Let him fucking get to it, instead of fucking derailing him into this hypothetical description which preempts the fucking issue, which you won't even let him fucking get to. It's insufferable. It's absolutely insufferable. And how many times can you hit someone over the head with a technical, with almost a hypothetical ancillary issue, in order to effectively never let them get to actually making the case for the thing that they want, so that you can essentially interrupt them in the descriptive pontification, which he says he doesn't even disagree with you. So then you can essentially strawman his argument and say, well, actually, you haven't made a case for that yet. Well, because you haven't fucking let him make a case for it. It's disgusting. I mean, I guess this is what happens when essentially, now when I talk about bad faith, now this is what I think is bad faith, is that this is not a discussion. Sam Harris is chairing the discussion, and he's not ceding the chair. When Bret is talking, he's not letting he's not giving any intellectual charity to Bret, uh, uh, to say, okay, well, look, I have this ancillary point here, but I can tell that it's ancillary to the argument that you're trying to construct. So, well, I'll table it for now, and we can come back to it. How about that, fucking Sam Harris? But no, you can't do that. That would be uh, too. Um, that would be to cede too much ground, to be forced to hear something that then you would have to confront, beyond the safety of one's own rehearsed, scripted contentions, in which you need essentially to center your argument around your straw man, because otherwise you don't even have an understanding of the subject. Without your understanding of how free will is illusory, you don't even want to hear how there might be another construction of free will that doesn't accord with the illusory straw man, which your whole intellectual edifice is centered around managing and redirecting. In some sense, I mean, to me, it's slightly solipsistic, or even psychotic. Um, Sorry, not psychotic, psychopathic. Because essentially, there's no subconscious diplomacy. I mean, there are parallels to this in the borderline stuff that I talk about. Um, and I think, and this manipulation as well. I mean, I've heard Bret describe Sam in this way, that essentially, in I think, in the bad faith thing, which was not Bret's podcast, but Bret was just talking to the Rebel Wisdom guys, about bad faith. And although he wasn't using Sam Harris as an example of bad faith, he said, oh, I guess he kind of implied that Sam Harris was clever, that he's not falling into being captured by his own audience because he's sort of outsmarting his own audience and he's capable of rebuking them in some sense. And although he has a lot of anti-Islam stuff, he tries to temper that by, let's say, exacerbating his anti-Trump attitude in order to kind of prove his good faith or something like that, I guess, to be more palatable to lefty type people, or people, I don't know why that label would even apply, to the totalitarian borderline crowd on the left or whatever, those pseudo intellectuals. And to tell you the truth, I mean, I find this kind of manipulative coercion and editorialism, essentially. So you're going to buy into the whole hysterical news mobbing of fake news, essentially, just so that you can sort of pretend to be balanced. So that to not attract the wrong crowd because you say some stuff that is anti-Muslim, you're going to sort of pepper it with some anti-Trump sentiment. I mean, like, have you ever heard, that, like, to me, that's more psychopathic. It's more of the same style of coercion as and manipulative framing. Um, this is what I would call sort of bad reality testing in some sense. Okay, so you're not going to be captured by a toxic audience by essentially trying to corral your audience into having virtues that you're going to sort of attach to them surreptitiously by tailoring your message. I mean, so you've just created a heuristic to monitor your content in place of not being controlled by your audience monitoring your content. And the heuristic is superior because you're playing some kind of partisan hackery. I mean, so you're going to make yourself a kind of neutral huckster, or pretend to be neutral. I mean, yeah, what the hell? I mean, so you're not going to be captured by a toxic audience. So instead, you can be captured by a by a kind of infidelity by a heuristic that is actually an artificial measure of infidelity in order to sort of keep your audience on its toes, so that it's more capable of being diverse or having a spectrum or something like that. In some sense, I think, this just makes Sam Harris a magnet, a further. I mean, in some sense, Sam Harris's audience, I think, was always that kind of toxic borderline audience, what I've described as rationality rules. That personality, that YouTube personality, being a prime example of what I've described as a cerebral histrionic. And I do think that Sam Harris's general style feeds into that. And he was not going to be outshone by Bret and have to think new novel things. And he was going to play to the same, I mean, Christopher Hitchens had this same brittle style in some sense, where he became a brand of anti-theism, and he would make the same arguments no matter almost what the other person was saying. Peter Hitchens complained about this when he was in a debate with Christopher, how it was all such an obvious sort of act, and how he didn't even think that the audience could hear him that well, and the whole thing was because the microphone sounded weird to him or whatever, so he wasn't even sure if what he was saying was being heard, and then the kind of the jeering and the cheering of the crowd was sort of, was just so robotic in a sense. It's that kind of thing. I mean, I'll also point out that there was a debate which Christopher Hitchens clearly lost, and that was the debate against David Berlinski. But anyway, and that's worth pointing out. That if you watch the David Berlinski debate and you see the attitude of the intellect, what made that debate so brilliant as well was David Berlinski's tone, his intellectual tone, his affectation was a perfect conduit for directly confronting the intrinsic intellectual dishonesty being perpetrated, as it were. I mean, look, I love Christopher Hitchens. I don't wish to soil his memory, but uh, he was certainly capable of going under fire, um, to make the unpopular moves. I think he did sort of rather pigeonhole himself and brand himself in the anti-theist sort of thing, but he said enough things in private to the other horsemen that that was pretty clear that he was receptive. I mean, he wasn't deaf to the kind of argumentation that David Berlinski um, was giving. I mean, David Berlinski himself, not even a full blown, um, a kind of a moral deist probably in his particular belief, but not a um, he doesn't have a particular theistic brand, as it were. He is a very consolidated ethical. Uh, 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 anyway, I'm not. It's always a bit tricky describing people's internal states of belief. Let me not. But anyway, let me just say that the intellectual sympathy that Hitchens had with certain forms of theistic structures of belief, which he wasn't open about. He did not advertise them in some sense, but in some sense that's because I always take Richard Hitchens as being an opponent of brittle theism, the kind of criticism. There are certainly brands of theism that what Christopher Hitchens said and the critiques that he made certainly do apply, and I even laud him for that work, because that work, the kind of religion that Christopher Hitchens was an opponent of, is something that is worth opposing. It's just as a semantic label that doesn't extend to all theological um, systems and frameworks and such. But anyway, which he never made that concession publicly, I think, too much. Perhaps he did sort of imply it, but um, he didn't he didn't labour that point at the very least. And David Berlinski hit him over the head for that. Essentially, David Berlinski completely trounced him, essentially, for that failure, as it were. And he obviously heard those arguments. He was in the room, and he knew that his position was quite sorely deficient in contrast to David Berlinski's poignant contentions. Anyway, and so what I believe is going on with Sam Harris is preemptively circumventing getting into getting into the position that Christopher Hitchens was in with David Berlinski, to use that as a metaphor. That Sam Harris was essentially muddying the field of confrontation. Blunting the instruments of exchange, essentially creating a red herring, which really a fabricated red herring at that, because there was no real point of contention, and he could have just said, okay, well, I guess I have a finer ancillary description, which is part of, let's say, which is probably generative of the kind of distinction in the space which you're trying to outline in order to make your argument, because you have to make, because Bret obviously has to make his position possible before he can articulate it, right? He has to make the space where it's possible. So he's saying, please hold this space for me. Please contend. Please, it's not the right word, not contend. Please suspend your disbelief that something is impossible in this space, and let me demarcate that space and demarcate how it might be possible that that space even exists, and then give me the intellectual charity to hold those possibilities as you hear my argument, which then he never gets to articulate because Sam Harris is sort of so confined to the grooves of his straw man farm or whatever. Now, this thing, in some sense, this is the thing that destroys discussion. This is the thing that destroys exchange and negotiation, as it were. And in some sense, it is a deeper psychological facet. And I'm going to read now my comments that I wrote on the Bret Weinstein interview with Rebel Wisdom. Okay, so this Rebel Wisdom video is what happened to the intellectual dark web, Bret Weinstein. So my comment was, this was a good interview with good substance. I would just like to draw attention to a set of questions that I believe should have been given their own center stage, in brackets, although I understand that it probably would have made this interview too disjointed to focus on the sub-issue directly. Within the subject of bad faith, Bret intimated important considerations and features that it would have been worthy to explore this issue further in terms of nescience and the various structures and forms of ideological confections of nescience that propound bad faith in real time and make its manufacturers operate as bad faith pedants, callous to their own internal redirection of dishonesty or diversion of their internal dishonesty. Although this topic is in my particular wheelhouse, being focused solely on the paradigms at which the fields of psychology and philosophy intersect, I have a video that is focused on borderline personality disorder that I just released on my YouTube video. Near the end of the video, I make political ideological parallels as to how the structure of that personality disorder is collectively employed by some ideological structures. This is an entirely large can of worms to open, but I do think it directly relates to this important issue of bad faith. Also, another video of mine which explores this issue is my commentary on the YouTuber rationality rules in my assessment of his debate with Stefan Molyneux, and my description of rationality rules as cerebral histrionic style of intellectualism. Okay, I guess that didn't... Anyway, the Bret Weinstein video on what happened to the intellectual dark web, he goes into this issue of bad faith, is a very important video. It really does have good stuff there. So anyway, I'm just sort of pointing that out. So anyway, I'm going to stop my recording now. I guess that's pretty much it. I just wanted to comment on Sam Harris. I guess I'll just make some other further slightly cultural topics. So I do think that it's this is the corrosive element that sort of creeps into. I think also it's interesting that you'll notice that the people that, I don't even believe Bret Weinstein is immune to this. Like I've seen what I consider to be certain aspects of virtue signaling from Bret in sort of going on and on about Trump, in these very superficial nitpicked, this is signifying of this kind of systemic racism, or sort of how it sort of feeds into that circus of interpretive projection and things like that. I guess, I see these ideological things perhaps more clearly than other people, and I'm very sensitive to I I guess you could say I have an extra strategy that I am deploying, and my strategy is to stay clear of getting entrapped and captivated by these collective systems of ideological intellectual dishonesty. And in some sense, I feel that tokens of allegiance are handed too freely to these mobs. Uh, um, to this mob justice paradox, essentially, that you have to sort of, you think that you can get some ways into dismantling that mob justice by sort of giving it some token of fealty. And this is I think is very, very problematic, and this is actually where you end up saying things that come back to haunt you, and when you essentially dilute your own message and you dilute your own efficacy. And it would be better to confront directly. And also, there was a thing about Richard Grannon where I was going to actually make a similar kind of meta point. But anyway, just in terms of the style of his dissemination, although it's not to critique someone's style is not the same thing as critiquing their substance. And I'm making an argument that the style does imply a substantive position, which I was just making a comment on that in some sense, a general plea, a general comment, that more free agents are better than these middling free agents that are giving these tokens of fealty to intellectual dishonesty. But the other point to be raised here is then my strategy in some sense. I mean, perhaps people can say that it's bad, is to not operate in the sense of providing anything other, to not give emotional support to anyone in this intellectual realm, because then you've already crossed over into their currency of intellectual sympathy. And so I will give intellectual charity, but I won't give emotional charity to people. And in some sense, then I can preserve my claim that I'm being serious about sorting out what there is to be sorted out and what can be sorted out. And you don't step into their virtual circus act of pretending that they can hypothetically contend with things that they have no measure or way of doing it. And I feel like you're just fueling that whole false paradigm by even giving them their token of support, of sort of morale building, and sort of and then you find actually that a lot of these movements, even themselves, are very badly constructed. There is no basis for them whatsoever, other than just this confection of hyperrealism, and it's been purely manufactured by reporting that is fundamentally fake. I've said, for example, as you know, all the supposed racial stuff in America would be solved if you, let's say, this is just a thought experiment. This is not a real a policy suggestion. But let's just say that you passed a law that would impose a certain level of consistency, because they're psychopathically inconsistent, that you would say that you can only report about crime stories, about anything to do with law and order and crime and whatever, if you report them in a statistically representative way. So you have to take like the FBI crime statistics, and you have to take every time a policeman is killed or injured, and essentially if you want to, and you pool all of that and you statistically analyze all of that, and if you want to report any one of those stories, you have to report every other kind of story in an exact parity of proportion. And then essentially you would have audiences that would be exposed to a cross-section of reality and not just a cherry-picked segment of reality. And then people would develop their own stereotype thinking in some sense. They would say, okay, well, actually, you know, a lot of cops are actually getting hurt on the job. A lot of cops actually go through a lot of danger and stress. And yes, actually, they're not just bad cops, they're also good cops. And there are actually these different kinds of scenarios that seem to be replaying themselves, that, you know, and then you start to actually get a three-dimensional picture of reality instead of just this hyperrealism and this confected impression. Um, and essentially that would sort itself out. Then you wouldn't have this anymore, because essentially this is a selection bias manufactured psyop in some sense. Um, and essentially it's been promoted by identity politics morality. It's been exacerbated by essentially making that narrative true, making it seem like the conducive canonical empirical epistemological token of reality. That it should be the model that we all think through. It should be how we filter reality and how we arbitrate over it, is through the filter of identity. It's just propaganda for that fascistic conception of society, which has become the cultural hegemon. It has become in vogue. Anyway, and so when I watch people sort of trying to manage that general cultural toxicity to some degree by playing into it, it just incenses me. And I see Bret Weinstein doing this kind of stuff to some degree. I mean, he also says very elucidating things, but essentially I feel like they are, in token, they are throwing Trump under the bus when they don't need to, and it's not really relevant in some sense. You know, where they go out of their way to say things essentially to look balanced, I guess, or some shit like that. I mean, Trump is not really a central figure in this. You know, the reporting about Trump in some sense is more indicative of, like, you know, what is propelling this constant insanity. I mean, maybe we wouldn't need to have an American president be someone like President Trump, but essentially he's got the only personality that can actually cut through the confected narrative, because essentially he's not tracking details, he's tracking themes, and he's just addressing the themes and his own, and you can't pin him to his words because that's not how he communicates. He communicates intuitively. And I'll say this, thank God for Trump, because without someone with that kind of makeup, with that kind of intellectual intuitive grasp, it would just be a complete shit show of falling prey to the semantic games of this borderline constructed hyperrealism. Um, so to join in the chorus of deriding Trump for exactly essentially his talent and ability for not being deluded and disorientated by this hyperrealism confected fascistic conception of reality, and to keep the themes intact, and to keep some view on the American spirit and founding values, you know, of libertarian values, in which you're not treated as as a kind of real political faction in some kind of fascistic political arena. Um, you know, I mean, Trump is really the only bulwark right now culturally against full-blown fascism, which is being pushed by the so-called left, um, in their real politics of identity. Um, I mean, they basically are proponents of an ethno-state. That's exactly what they're pushing for. That's their moral system. Anyway, I'm not doing this too much justice. This is a bit of a tangent, but let me just move on. I was going to say that what the hell? Ben Shapiro sadly also has this problem with him. Ben Shapiro also can make very, very poignant intellectual points, and a lot of what he says is common sense that needs to come to the table, that needs to be brought down to bear. But his overarching style, in some sense, I'm afraid, has the same defect. I mean, look, being a partisan. Let me think of an example of this. I guess when David Berlinski, I think, didn't directly shine a light on it. Well, no, he fairly did directly shine a light on it, but he didn't he didn't um, he didn't expand on it and magnify it tremendously, but he did point at it. In Ben Shapiro had an interview with David Berlinski, and David Berlinski just asked a few sort of open-ended questions as to, let's say, Ben Shapiro's general framework, and you can see how Ben Shapiro just he can't operate on that level because he doesn't essentially have a how he roots his principles in some sense are locked into the subjective paradigm, which in some sense is scripted narratively, and you can say, oh, okay, well, I mean, that's because he is coming from a kind of theological narrative polemic in some sense, and when he is engaging in public life, that's a sub process of his overarching identity, which to me anyway, that makes some of his intellectualism on the deeper level, on the deeper spiritual level, it makes it somewhat deficient. um, and in some sense he will say, well, that's my private religious philosophy and that's none of your business. That's essentially would be his defense, I guess, to that kind of accusation that I just made. But anyway, it makes, to my mind, his overarching philosophy non-transparent. It makes it slightly opaque, and though he can still make good, concise, clear points as a partisan, um, that makes him effectively not a member of the intellectual dark web, as far as I can see it. It makes him unfit to be a member of the intellectual dark web, um, which is itself not a club of a few elite members. It is supposed to be a cultural phenomenon. It is supposed to be a process, and I think that there are some people that are just they're not ready or they are unfit to be part of that process, and I'm I've outlined essentially some of the problems of a kind of nescient bad faith, which can be both ideological and psychological, um, a nescient variant of bad faith, and now I think I've gone through a full set um, of all those features. So anyway, obviously in my not in the most eloquent fashion, but at least I think I've gone through the whole. I think I've dealt with this topic quite in a nice consolidated way, although obviously in a long-winded sense, as is my style. Okay, now this is going to be a continuation of the last recording when I was going into nescience on the level of bad faith, and this is also connected to cerebral, what I've described before as cerebral histrionic manifestation or presentation. Now, I think it's problematic that I've used the word histrionic because my definition of it is just a label to the structures that I've described in relation to that, and I do feel that I perhaps don't even know what the official sort of characterization of histrionic presentation is. So that label might be itself just fundamentally sort of without merit, although within my own internal semantic description of it, it is still meaningful in some sense, but it's just a hollow label. Anyway, I do feel I do need to revise some of this stuff though, because now that I think fully captured exactly what's going on with borderline in all of its eccentric different facets of sophistication and possible manifestations of issue in some sense, I think now it becomes more clear to describe what's going on, for example, in the ideological nescience in some sense of Sam Harris, and how that sort of somewhat crosses the line into in some sense, I do think that he has beliefs about things. It's hard to tell which came first. Is it a psychological? Um, is it that his psychology was already acclimatized to that style of thinking, and therefore he created a belief structure around free will? And obviously, free will is one of those things which is close in theme to how an identity functions. If you believe something about free will, it attaches to your identity, it attaches to your self image, right? So, you get that sort of that hybridized sort of issue where, well, this is how I think identity politics essentially makes people into a hybridized borderline, because the identity becomes the mediator for their self image, becomes the overarching um, reality filter and the conduit for accessing and maneuvering. In some sense, it becomes the totem. Um, it becomes the sort of the gateway for dealing with reality and mediating reality with the inner child structure. And it even organizes the inner child as well to a large degree. It has to be integrated. It has to sort of be completely integrated into the inner child structures. And so it has effects beyond the inner child, and it has effects within the inner child, and in terms of its organization. Um, okay, so free will is one of those things, one of those similar things, but in some sense, it's more constrained than identity. Identity, in some sense, is broader because it has to do with mediating, let's say, more immediate energies, more immediate relations. Whereas free will, in some sense, I think this is why Sam Harris is obsessed with his, let's say, I can't remember what they call it, but with the illusion of free will, the illusory feeling of free will. Why his philosophy has that as one of its centerpieces, because it's sort of, he has to keep that lie alive in some sense. He has to animate it. He has to sort of relate to it. That's part of. So he's got like a two-stage totem in his ideology about free will. Is that he's got like the greater totem of the kind of abstract contemplative conceptualization of metaphysics, and then he's got this lesser totem, which is like the illusion of free will, which can still essentially, which he has to operate it, because that's so he's got like a psychological truth and he's got a metaphysical truth, and they are disparate to each other, but he's got an excuse as to why he can still prefer the one but still intellectually depend on the other. And so he's kind of got, the best of both worlds in some sense there, and that's probably why he's strewn in that particular sort of confected ideology in some sense. Whereas people that believe in identity politics, in some sense, they also actually sometimes have a bit of a dual thing, because they have a kind of, well, privately I can have my private views, as long as I always, when I act in the world, I'm mediating them through this filtration system. So they have this kind of, you can sort of see why, for example, as an example, most of the Democratic Party belong to the Ku Klux Klan, or at least a large portion of the leadership in the Democratic Party. It's in that elite cultural, they have this two-faced sort of thing, that there's the public face and there's the private. Anyway, okay, that's at least a rough illustration of that kind of bifurcation. Where there's a fatal, so usually in terms of identity politics, it's actually on the level of fatalism. So you have this public morality, and then you have this intrinsic internal fatalism about, like some people, they just have, like, it's like luck. It's like a cosmic luck thing. So if you are arbitrated by this identity matrix, and there is a Führer, and politically everything has to conform to this new system, well, then how do you justify differences in status at that point? If they actually win the revolution, if they win their fascistic takeover and totalitarian inception of everything, how do you account for differences then? Um, you always have to be on the right side of the witch hunt. You always have to sort of, which is why you need an external enemy to sort of help to consolidate the internal cohesion of the system. It has this kind of constant civil war attached to it, but also with all the things that, if you're not on the right side of the conflict, of the group collective camouflage of the system, how do you mediate small differences that will otherwise go unattached, that you can't find a way to escalate into them being adopted by the Führer and orchestrated and administered by the Führer? How do you deal with that? And so there's that private space, and you can see that that same private space probably exists within Sam Harris in terms of the illusion of free will, that he's got a second set of tables, he's got a second set of accounting, in that he has to, how is he going to manage the illusion of free will psychologically? And that secondary economy, in some sense, has a lot of, let's say, creative freedom attached to it, and then that creates a second kind of domain for him to try to optimize in some sense, and he can't move away from that probably. But look, even if I've got it slightly semantically wrong from what's going on in Sam Harris's mind, it's going to be something analogous to something like this, and maybe he'll try to consolidate them, he'll try to reconcile them, that they both have the same system of contemplative administration or something like that. Anyway, I don't know how deep he wants to go into. Anyway, even if it has a kind of technical symmetrical consistency between the two, it's going to, because essentially they're not the same pool, they're not the same entities, they're not the same calculus, that even if you can say that you're applying the same rules to them and the same style of judgment to them, so that you are consistent in some way, that consistency is completely veiled. It might as well be arbitrary, um, because there's no correlation between those manifestations anyway. Or who knows, maybe he's got some crazy mythology that sort of squares that circle. But anyway, this is all quite metaphorical as well. But as an illustration, I just wanted to get to the point of saying that that then what is the cerebral histrionic thing in some sense? I think in some sense it's the semblance of a borderline functionality. It's a semblance of a borderline functionality. Or it's yeah, it actually is. Or certain components of the borderline thing. Like, it's not committed to the structure, but it finds itself in that structure, and essentially it finds itself in that structure because it believes that these heuristics are the tokens of good faith. It has supplemented its own thinking. It doesn't actually, it doesn't want to find the answer to the problem, it wants to find a heuristic to answer the problem. So it has already resigned reason itself. It has already relegated actually finding an answer with reason. It just wants the heuristic instead, because the model, the 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 task which the heuristic, the computational process that the heuristic, and then essentially this becomes problematic, because essentially the task becomes agentified. It becomes dignified and anthropomorphized as an actual agent, because it actually is supplanting agency. That mechanism, that task, that heuristic, that test supplants the actual immediate, let's say, conundrum of epistemic responsibilism. So it's a shirking of epistemic responsibilism into a sort of a constructed heuristic, which then you get this weird thing where the ideology has a job to do. It must be given information so that it can render its answer. It's like Brainiac in the Superman in the Superman comic book. Brainiac is the better scientist. So our scientists don't understand it, but Brainiac understands it for us. So Brainiac just tells us the answer because it's more clever than we are. I'll just point out that I think who was a kind of who saw into some of these thematic issues is in the Dune saga, the Butlerian. I can't remember what it's called. The Butlerian Revolution or something. Uh, anyway, where they won't even use computers to compute complex mathematical answers. They have mentalks to do that. That everything is done by human intelligence. That there is no supplementation of human intelligence with artificial um, displacement of agency in some sense. So at least that if something is going on or going wrong, there is an agent that then can be, I guess, can hold the burden of accountability, that it's not just sort of diffused into some kind of camouflage of some system or some kind of ideological system or some kind of ideological framework, that it very clearly everything is underwritten by an agent's epistemic responsibilism. Um, anyway, oh, I remember now. It was called the Butlerian Jihad. Anyway, in the Dune books. So, and in some sense, you can see that that has a way of removing this, or at least some aspects or some manifestations of this kind of toxicity from being hidden, at least from. I mean, it doesn't completely remove that toxicity from the human realm of diplomacy, but in some sense, it does make it so that it exists within humanity purely and not within hidden systems of essentially creating brainiacs, creating heuristics, creating algorithms that can be said to sort of hold this hidden influence. That displaces the accountability of epistemic agents. Anyway, I was also okay. Yeah, so my topic is, so in some sense I think that what I called cerebral histrionic presentation, in some sense, is a mini ideological version of this, of borderline. In some sense, it's a mini replica of it, and essentially it's a, again, like to abstract it out into a kind of more philosophical sort of thing. This happens when essentially when you substitute answering a question with a test, and you've constructed a test that then it's just your job to feed the test the test input, and then you believe the answer that the test derives. But essentially, the problem with this kind of ideological style is that if the substituted test does not actually have a human reason that can be it sort of, it grinds up human reason, it completely dismantles it into a reduction which is actually not, doesn't actually have, it doesn't keep fidelity with reality and reason. It actually uses an illegitimate substitution of reality testing. So it uses a heuristic that is meant to like approximate a test, but it's not a real test. And in some sense, some things can't really be tested. Like, and one of those things is epistemic agency itself. You cannot create a replica substitution for epistemic agency, which is effectively, which is in some sense, that is the process of exteriorizing accountability. So no, you're not going to find a valid way to exteriorize your accountability. Well done, you've just found one of the metaphysical limits, but now you've created an ideology that essentially assumes that that is a valid move. And you don't want to give up the hypothetical purview that it gives you, the predictive capacity that it offers you, the hypothetical armchair reach that that it extends to your contemplative realm, because it believes that this is actually a valid faculty when it's not. Um, in some sense, it's a hypothetical faculty which is defective, but since you're already entrenched in the process, you're not looking you're not looking at it from the outside. You're not even you don't care to judge it. It is your point of departure. So you're proceeding from an incorrect premise. And you've also sort of jettisoned your ability to want to go back and revise that premise, because then you're left with nothing or less than what you had, or than what you currently think you have, even though you don't currently have that because it's fake. But this is the problem: is that it doesn't want to give up. It's like the monkey that is stuck in the trap because it won't let go of the food, and so it can't release its hand from the hole that is small enough to put the hand in, but it's not big enough to get the hand out while it's holding the thing. So it's that kind of monkey trap. And which I guess you could say is some version of the sunk cost fallacy. Maybe. Uh, anyway, the so I mean, it really is a failure of intellectual charity to some degree that people can't actually box their own ideology and then contend against it from outside. The notion of somewhat, to believe something, to believe in something, or to believe on something in a somewhat fashion, so that one can consider alternatives. One, that kind of humility of critical thinking in some sense. And essentially, these people are brats. They just don't want to. They don't want to do it another way, because essentially, I mean, it's a kind of, they can find a way to make that greed a private choice or something like that. Um, and in some sense, that kind of insulation is a form of, I would vaguely call it autism. Um, or it's autistic, surely. Now, usually, this kind of autism would just be confined to certain dry intellectual cults, as it were, like scientism, like the cult of determinism, and because there are lots of people who perhaps they're good scientists in some field, but their philosophy is just weak as shit. Sam Harris being one of these people. And you can see the brittle foundation that it is fundamentally premised on. Essentially, that it's locked into this thing, because it also provides a field of a kind of objective matrix that they can always be making ground, even though essentially they can always be accumulating pieces of the puzzle. Even if they don't have all the pieces of the puzzle yet, they can believe that they're making genuine progress, because anything that they find is sort of grounded by this intrinsic sort of method, in some sense, that this is the best that we can do. So if it's not the optimized solution, then they can't actually build a pile of shit of it. In some sense, they can't get anywhere by stacking it up. So they have to believe that this has been optimized in some sense, and that it is the best raw material for refinement in some later incomplete, sort of inculcation of something. Essentially, I mean, they're just building Brainiac, which is in some sense the mirror reflection of their internal premise, that they started with, that essentially you can outsource epistemic agency, that you can make a heuristic, which is essentially a kind of rationality machine, and that will supplant reason. That rationality is a valid form of displacement of reason, which it is not. Rationality is actually, the principle of the logical axiom of transitivity is fundamentally flawed. It is erroneous. It is wrong. It is false. Transitivity, which tells you, I've said this before, I'll just reiterate it here. Basically, transitivity is like, if A equals B and if B equals C, then A equals C. That's true by the axiom of transitivity. Now, the problem with the axiom of transitivity, that's the transitivity of equivalences. So those, because these things are equivalating, that because those equivalences can be transitively transposed, then we can know the last line there. Now, it is not true that if A equals B and if B equals C, then A equals C. It's not true. Because you actually have to add a term which is impossible to construct. You have to add a term like, if A equals B and only, and only that if A equals B and in all cases of that if, or something like that, A equals B. If and only. I mean, there's no way to actually say it, but essentially, if and only. Because you see, essentially, if there are other conditions added to that, you could say A equals B and then add a further condition and a further condition and a further condition. That might add a complex dynamism within these identities of A and B and C. They could add other dimensions of, let's say, of facets of these identities that will lead to problems of chirality or something like that, to use a chemical analogy, of spin, that essentially these things could have the same identities in certain contexts but not have the same equivalencies in other contexts of different, of further conditions in some sense. So the problem is that you can't say if A equals B, because you have to attach all possible conditions to the if A equals B. You have to say something like if A equals B in all possible conditions. Now that itself is not even semantically commensurate, because essentially if you want to say in all possible conditions, that's not the phrase in all possible conditions is a complexity, is a complex space that has no it has different permutations that are contradictory, that between those permutations there are contradictions. So you have to specify in which possible conditions particularly, and that itself also is to catalog that is impossible. That is an infinite task. So you can't do anything with transitivity. It's just a figment of your fucking imagination. It's a logical wish convenient list. And in some sense, it actually presupposes something about the nature of reality itself. It says that logic itself is, or rationality even, it kind of presupposes that rationality is the base code of the universe, is the base code of reality. That is a presumption that is unjustifiable. It's not reasoned, it's merely presumed by the axiom of transitivity. It's bullshit. It's a theological banner of utter conjecture and wish thinking. It's a blind faith. It's a blind faith. That's exactly what it is. The axiom of transitivity is an article of blind faith. Finished. Okay. Now, essentially, this is the Trojan horse that all this thinking in exteriorizing epistemic agency or supplementing for epistemic agency by an exterior heuristic, this is what it's fundamentally premised on, right? It's just weaving this same false notion into a false authority, into a false objective paradigm of an exterior paradigm, so that one can escape the ravages of reason and be nestled by the warm bosom of a worldly god, of an exterior locus of control, of a tyrant, of a sky father, of a Zeus figure in the sky, you know. So what we're really confronting here is idolaters. That's what we're dealing with. That's what, I mean, sadly, this is psychologically what it all boils down to. This is what the false ego is all premised on, is these species of idolatry in some general sense, but also in this particular ideology, or these kinds of contraptions which come to populate the contents of the false ego, not just the overarching structure. It's the unwieldy extension of the imagination, of the hypothetical faculty, into generating a kind of false source of epistemic credulity or credibility or currency in some sense. And then that creates a whole secondary economy of rational alignment, which then one gets into trying to fortify and to... Anyway, now obviously, to the extent to which the particular ideology and the particular substance applies to human affairs, you know, so obviously some things can be so dry and technical that they have no bearing on humanity in some sense. This is why the legal found the well-developed legal cultures and legal intellectual traditions are often the repository of the height of reason. And I mean this. I take this to be there's only one decent legal tradition in the world today, sadly, and that is the Roman Dutch substantive law with the British common law and procedural, is the South African legal system, is in fact the only inheritor of the Roman Dutch, of the Roman substantive law, which means that all the law has principles, has general principles of general application, and they are elaborated by case law in some sense. But the overarching framework is solid philosophy, solidly reasoned. Sadly, we've had things corrupted now because of the fascistic bullshit, and the disgusting betrayal of the Constitution by these fascistic legal theory proponents and theoreticians that trying to get their disgusting legal positivism into rationalizing the reinterpretation of basic words to fit their disgusting morality and corruption of the constitutional values. They have such semantic bullshit powers that they can make anything fly. And they get their academics to come from overseas to infuse them with inspiration for more destruction and betrayal of the Constitution. as part of this academic hotbed of disgusting fascistic ideology. But yeah, I mean, so we can see the field. We can see the uh, we can see the war waging, the confrontation. It is these are the deep themes of it, and we can see it anyway. So when I guess I'm calling someone a cerebral histrionic, I guess the reason why I call them that is because I've often called people histrionic if they are complicit with borderline ideology in some sense. If they're not the producer of it because they don't have it inside them, but they are sympathetic to it, and I've often felt that the kind of codependency that borderlines produce with their henchmen or their hosts, or is that their host has to have their buttons pushed by the borderline. They have to be receptive to the borderline conditioning. And I believe that the only way to do that in some sense is that the borderline steals the key to entering this game of exterior. So in some sense, the borderline is printing the money of this currency, of the secondary economy, and then they are sort of saying you're not part of the economy unless you pay, unless you allow me to induct you, unless you allow me to sort of to bite you, and you contract the you take on the mark of joining that sort of theological idolatry in some sense. Um, and so, I mean, that's essentially what the mark of the beast is. The mark of the beast is the exchange, that somebody else is says essentially, I'm not going to construct this own idolatry within me, but I'm going to join the idolatry within you. So I will give you the key to my adulation, to my admiration in some sense, and you will envelop me in your system, in your currency. Um, so it's like the borderline becomes the nation, and then the exchange is that this person becomes a citizen of that nation. So the histrionic, cerebral histrionic, I see them, they are citizens in some sense. Now, in some sense, then it's weird because essentially I think they're on their way to trying to construct it themselves. They're trying to re-engineer it, reverse engineer it, because they are just from the outside looking at it. Like they're part of a culture that has a brainiac. They don't understand how brainiac works. They didn't invent brainiac, but somebody else did, or collectively the system created brainiac, and they just want to be a member of the system. They want to be a member of that society. And then, as they are a member of it, they are slowly maybe trying to understand it themselves, but they don't need to understand it. They can just be a cerebral histrionic. They can just sort of believe that there is a solution to that problem, but they don't have to find the solution or be actively looking for it, but they could contemplatively be in a roundabout way looking for it. So anyway, I think that a cerebral histrionic is someone who is a joiner, who is not a promulgator, although indirectly they are also a promulgator in a collective sense, but that's just a cultural incidental feature. Um, so essentially, they say, I don't have the answer, but I know that I'm on the right track and I'm with those who are on the right side. So that's what I would call the histrionic element in some sense. They just want to join, they just want to tag along, they just want to attach themselves. Okay. And in some sense, and which is why they can't defend the system, because they don't even care about understanding it, they just care about proving its authoritative potency in some sense. So, they're just basically appealing to authority. That's all they ever do, is sort of they try to create tokens of conventional authority, which then they appeal to. They're like, oh, well, I don't understand it, but, clever people understand it. And so if you don't agree with them, then you're stupid. That's the kind of basic outline. And in some sense, see, Sam Harris, see, someone who does this on an ideological level, or who sees themselves as a thought leader, is pretty deep into this, right? They're pretty some sense they're both. They're both followers, and they are keepers of this blind faith, I think. Um, and if they fail, then they will try to find somebody else who is successful, maybe. And point towards them as working on the answer. I mean, in some sense, they don't need to have the full answer, because in some sense, the whole system is based on an abrogation of epistemic responsibilism into an exterior paradigm that just needs its container needs to be fathomed. It's sort of they just need to find a solid limit exterior to them that they can rationally transpose as an internal model to sort of follow and to be in the image of, in some sense. They need a contemplative container in order to help frame their internal, to be consistent with it, so that they can sort of say that they're at the height of technical proficiency, in some sense, or that they have this kind of commensurability with the only source of authority that can be imagined, hypothetically, in some sense. That's sort of what their ego function is telling them. But the actual structure of pervading that in their inner child, is this hideous contortion that produces the kind of shit show that it happened in the Bret Weinstein podcast 9 months ago, the number 8 podcast of the Dark Horse podcast with Sam Harris. But anyway, okay. What else? Did I want to give more examples of this? I hate being critical. Yeah. I mean, there are other people that I think are considered as part of the intellectual dark web, and I won't go overboard and say that they are not helpful to the intellectual dark web, but I will say that people that have defects in style, sadly, like I see Joe Rogan as having a similar kind of, he's more of a, he has a light touch of cerebral histrionic. In some sense, perhaps he manifests that more just on the inner child side, on working out his belief structures. They are very fudged. In some sense, they are always in flux. They are not set. He doesn't have a set understanding that then he can make progress on. It's just a kind of, he's almost like a kind of a collective memory bank of the current zeitgeist, and so he's very good at updating it, because there aren't that many they're not really solid structures there. So he's just kind of going with the flow, which means that if he's dealing with someone who is, let's say, too far ahead of the current middle ground, he can't really relate with that in a respectful, intellectually clean and honest way, because he's somewhat always representing the middle ground, and he's always at the center in some sense, and he's very good at defining that center in some sense. He's almost channeling the zeitgeist to a large degree, and it's not without its functionality within, let's say, a system of dissemination of let's say, having discussions in which perhaps the intellectual dark web can disseminate its more probing things. But in some sense, when you're dealing with Joe Rogan, he's a bit of like a consolidated mass that is a bit fudged, is a bit congealed in some sense, and it's not fluid enough, it's not articulated, or anyway. So I see him as almost like, he's not a cerebral histrionic, but he's almost like a narcissistic precursor of that in some sense. So at least he's sort of honestly grappling with these things, but he never, in some sense, I think there might be something there might be more, he might have a different combination of. In some sense, I'm thinking that borderline, in some sense, is an archetypal map of immaturity and states of maturity that persist or that manifest in many different personality styles. So in some sense, borderline in some sense is an archetypal repository of all the different elements of things that can go wrong and twisted and toxic. And in some sense, different elements of those, different levels of those complications can be baked into people's inner child structures or their ideology or even they can get it from osmosis from their culture or how they relate to their subconscious, how they how their inner child structure has a certain kind of exchange or relational thing. So anyway, I think elements of what I've said about borderline in some sense, any combination of those elements that can be subtracted and compiled into like a generally recurring pattern of certain manifestations, I think might essentially allow for features of that to be manifest in particular personality styles. Um, and in some sense, I would say that what is generating this in Joe Rogan is probably his skepticism, that he has actually taken skepticism to be a kind of prime canonical value in his inner child as a belief structure. So his skepticism is his guiding luminary, sort of thing. And in some sense, I think that sort of precipitates a kind of psychopathic, or at least it can precipitate a psychopathic response to things that he can't assess in a very clean way because they're conceptually too far beyond what he can imagine, because he's always just contending immediately with what is currently in the subconscious environment. And so he can't imagine a subconscious in the future. He can't imagine a radically different subconscious than the one that he's actually experiencing. And he's so fixed into monitoring that subconscious field that if you represent something, he's just going to paint you with that subconscious, with that current subconscious vocabulary, with that current subconscious um, uh, and that's in a sense because skepticism needs, ironically, something to tether itself to in order to keep itself alive. And so it has to keep its eye on something, because skepticism is fundamentally a kind of adversarial opposition. And so you need something to be in opposition with. And so you have to sort of create a kind of, these false dichotomies and this binary thinking. And I do think that Joe Rogan is very much prone to that. And he's only saved by that by being continually updated by other people who are, which he's perhaps at the right time ready to sort of make that slight shift towards, or something like that. But you can't take him very much further than where he currently sits, as it were. You have to move him quite solidly from where he is to a new place. And, and he will take half a foot beyond that, maybe, in a direction. And he really has no good track record of even the direction that he moves from there. Because I think he's too grounded in his skepticism, essentially. Which is almost like he doesn't have a totem, but he has that kind of that secondary luminary totem, and the first totem is just always kept blank, and so he doesn't have a guiding canonical understanding to then update and maintain, and that persists in some sense. That first totem is just the kind of a reduction of the subconscious reading and monitoring. So he's just constantly, his first totem is just the subconscious, the sum total of the subconscious pool. In layman's terms, in a kind of vernacular translation, the zeitgeist. So the zeitgeist is his totem in some sense, which is being therefore and secondarily filtered by a kind of skepticism. And so he is always whittling away at what is in order to find something else. He doesn't have an independent external from the external environment. He doesn't have an independent read on it in some sense. Okay, well, now I've just sort of gone into character assassination of Joe Rogan, which will probably make me very unpopular. But anyway, he certainly has very ardent partisan supporters. But sadly, I think this is why this just goes on in my assessment of why certain people can certainly be considered adjacent to the intellectual dark web, but I think, yeah, he has been recorded, I think, as being described that way, adjacent to the intellectual dark web, but they cannot be considered members, or at least not in my understanding of my vision of what this is. And I think that if anything actually transgresses what I'm outlining, it's a recipe for absolute cessation and disintegration. Which I think it has already suffered, because there are people that I think are stultifying in this regard, and I've gone over them. Sam Harris has this aspect. Ben Shapiro has this aspect. Anyway, I'm going to stop this recording now.